This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
We all know that ancient Rome was a great civilization that spanned 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and dominated the Mediterranean. But very few people actually know how Rome came to be. Every ancient civilization wants to trace its own origins. If they really can't find them, they start making things up. Whether others believe it or not doesn't matter. What's important is giving themselves some psychological comfort. The Greeks claimed that their ancestors were the great heroes of the Trojan War, and Rome also wanted to connect itself to Troy. After Troy was captured by the Greek coalition, the Trojan hero Aeneas fled all the way and eventually settled on the Italian peninsula. And Romulus, who is said to have founded the Roman kingdom, was supposedly a descendant of Aeneas. Later, the Romans learned that the fall of Troy happened in the 13th century BC, while Romulus founded Rome in 753 BC, a gap of more than 400 years between the two events. So they came up with another story, claiming that one day Romulus's mother was sleeping by the river when she caught the eye of Mars, the god of war, who happened to be passing by. As a result, Romulus's mother was possessed by Mars in her sleep, and later gave birth to twin boys, Romulus and Remus. When the king learned of this, he flew into a rage and put the twins into a wooden barrel, throwing them into the Tiber River. The twins were found by a she-wolf, who fed them until they were full and then left. After that, a shepherd discovered them and raised them to adulthood. When the two brothers grew up and learned the truth about their origins, they naturally sought revenge against the king. After killing the king, they founded a city of their own. Later, the two brothers turned against each other over territory. Romulus killed Remus, and only then was the city officially named Rome after Romulus. This was in 753 BC. From this point on, Rome's history gradually moved beyond the era of myth and legend. After Romulus had secured his position, he began to abduct women from other tribes. Those who helped Romulus establish the city were all Latins, which proves that they were actually a group of bachelors abandoned by the Latins, and not as noble as the myths suggest. Starting from Romulus, Rome had a total of 7 kings. Later, it became a republic because the 7th king not only plotted to assassinate his predecessor, but also refused to hold a funeral for him, and carried out a massacre against the senators, appointed by the former king. In short, he committed every imaginable atrocity. The people hated this king to the core, so while he was away leading the army on a campaign, the Romans shut the city gates and told the king outside, "We have exiled you. To prevent another tyrant like you from endangering the people, Rome will never have a king again." This is how Rome transitioned from the era of monarchy to the era of the republic. Replacing the king were 2 consuls, elected each year by the citizens' assembly. The reason for electing 2 was to prevent any one person from holding too much power. When making any decision, if the 2 consuls disagreed, then the matter could not proceed. If an emergency arose, a temporary dictator would be appointed, and the decisions made by this dictator could not be interfered with, not even by the 2 consuls. However, the dictator's term was only 6 months, while the consuls served for 1 year. From the citizens to the Senate, to the consuls, and then to the dictator, each checked and balanced the others. This complex system of relationships was developed by the Romans only after enduring countless hardships. In the very beginning, Rome was extremely small, surrounded to the north and south by tribes many times stronger than itself, so they could only struggle to survive in the cracks between them. At that time, Rome was considered a barren land. Other tribes had no interest in it and would even detour around the area in disdain when passing by. Rome's initial living environment consisted of just 7 small hills, while most of the surrounding area was wetlands. Later, Rome expanded like a greedy snake, continuously annexing the surrounding small tribes. When the 7 hills of Rome could no longer contain them, they finally set their sights on the vast wetlands. The Romans dug sewers to channel the water from the wetlands into the Tiber River. This was an enormous project, and to this day, remnants of the sewers can still be found along the banks of the Tiber. The wetlands were replaced by public buildings such as squares and temples. The scattered 7 hills of Rome were also connected into a single whole, but the story of the Romans was only just beginning. Since ancient times, southern civilizations have often faced invasions from northern barbarian tribes. In 390 BC, ancient Rome suffered a catastrophic disaster at the hands of the Celts. At that time, northern Europe was covered by vast forests, and the Celts were the masters of these woods. Celts was the name given to them by the Greeks, while the Romans called them Gauls. In the 6th century BC, the Celts began a large-scale migration, crossing the Alps and settling in the area around present-day Milan. At first, the Celts did not pose a threat to Rome, because the Etruscans still served as a buffer to the north of Rome. However, in 396 BC, the Romans defeated the Etruscans and captured Veii, one of the Etruscans' most powerful cities. This victory came after a long war that lasted 10 years, so the entire Roman people celebrated nationwide. But that's how Rome was during wartime. Everyone stood united against the enemy, but as soon as the fighting ended, the nobles and the commoners couldn't wait to start infighting. This led the commoners to want to establish a second capital in Veii, with a status equal to that of Rome, so that they could free themselves from the oppression of the nobility. Although the civilians realized their wish, the Celts took the opportunity to invade the south in large numbers. The Celts had a custom. Every time they killed an enemy, they would cut off the person's head and hang it from their horse's neck. After the battle, they would soak the head in oil, and showing these enemy heads to guests was considered a form of hospitality. Previously, all the troops were stationed in Rome, so the Romans still had a chance to resist. But now, with their forces spread out, the Etruscan cities were quickly overrun, and soon after, Rome itself was in danger. The Roman army confronted the enemy in the upper reaches of the Tiber River, but they were quickly routed and scattered. The Celts marched into the defenseless city of Rome, and occupied it for as long as 7 months. months. During these 7 months, Rome became a living hell. The invaders spared neither men nor women, young nor old. Regardless of status, they burned, killed, looted, and committed every imaginable atrocity. Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, was extremely steep and easy to defend, but the summit was very narrow and could only accommodate a limited number of people. Only a handful of young people were relocated to the hill, while the rest could only resign themselves to fate. If this hill were to fall as well, then it would truly be the end for the Romans. The Romans were a people with a strong sense of pride. From atop Capitoline Hill, they watched helplessly as the Celts committed acts of barbarism against their homeland. Yet in the end, Rome was fortunate. Although the Celts were formidable warriors, they did not know how to live within a city. Corpses were thrown into the water, making it undrinkable. Because they favored the use of fire in their attacks, the wheat in the fields was quickly burned up. Corpses were not disposed of in time, and soon a plague broke out, claiming many lives each day. The Celts grew weary of city life, while the Romans besieged on Capitoline Hill also fell into famine. In the end, the Romans sent envoys to negotiate with the Celts. They paid a large ransom, asking the Celts to leave Rome. The Celts, delighted with the large amount of gold ingots they received, lifted their 7-month-long occupation of Rome. After the barbarians left, the Romans immediately organized a counterattack, but the blow dealt by this invasion was simply too great, and such actions could not heal the Romans' wounds. The Romans unanimously believed that this disaster was a punishment from the gods, because the gods had always resided in the city of Rome, yet they insisted on leaving to build a new capital, which was seen as abandoning the gods. The act of abandoning the gods was the reason disaster befell them. From that point on, no one ever advocated for building a new capital again. In this Celtic invasion, what Rome lost was not just its infrastructure. Even more serious was the collapse of its alliances. Because they were nearby, all the neighboring tribes saw how helpless Rome was in the face of barbarian invasion. So yesterday's allies all turned into Rome's enemies overnight. Not a no. Shame win. Rome had no choice but to go back to square one and use force to restore its alliances with the various tribes. Fortunately, although the Romans acted slowly, they still managed to struggle back to their feet. We all know the saying, all roads lead to Rome, and that's no exaggeration. The roads built by the Romans had one distinctive feature. Every road started from Rome itself and then extended outward. In just 500 years, the Romans built over 80,000 kilometers of main roads, and if you include the branch roads, the total length exceeded 150,000 kilometers. So why were the Romans so obsessed with building roads? While these roads certainly made it easier for the Roman army to expand outward, enemies could also use them to march straight into Rome. The famous Greek general Pyrrhus, who nearly destroyed Rome, and Hannibal from Carthage both advanced along roads built by the Romans themselves. In this light, building roads became a double-edged sword. This would plunge Rome into endless wars. In fact, the Romans built roads also to address their unique alliance system. In 390 BC, Rome was nearly destroyed by the Celts. When other tribes saw how easily Rome could be defeated, former allies quickly turned into Rome's enemies. It took Rome more than 20 years to recover, and they realized just how unreliable these so-called allies were. So, the Romans decided to redefine their relationships with their allies. Previously, the Romans had formed the Latin League. These alliances were all tribes that had been subdued by Rome. Although they acknowledged Rome as the leader, the alliances themselves were also interdependent. In other words, the relationship between a member tribe and Rome was not much different from its relationship with other member tribes. This meant that if Rome suffered a defeat, it would end up being abandoned by all. The Romans learned from this lesson, and after subduing these tribes again, they changed the Latin League into the Roman alliance. As the name suggests, this meant that Rome was at the center, and there would no longer be any relationships between the other allied tribes. The alliance agreement stipulated that member tribes could only establish friendly relations with Rome, and were not allowed to form connections with other member tribes. If any issues arose between member tribes, they could not resolve them privately. Instead, they had to seek arbitration from Rome. Rome was able to unilaterally set these rules simply because it was the victor in war during that era. It was completely normal for the defeated to lose their property and be enslaved, so Rome merely imposing an unequal alliance on the defeated was a very merciful approach. Moreover, Rome did not charge the allies any protection fees. They provided troops during wars. Of course, this could also be seen as an indirect way of collecting the costs needed to maintain military strength. In order to weaken the ties between the various allied tribes, Rome also divided them into different ranks, even among the tribes of the same Latin ethnicity as themselves. Because their language and religious customs were very similar, those with the closest ties were granted the same citizenship rights as Romans. Those with slightly weaker ties did not receive Roman citizenship, and so on. At the weakest level, the relationship was limited to mutual trade with Rome, and they were not even required to speak Latin. This was Rome's way of assimilating the defeated. These different levels of allies were all mixed together. This made it impossible for the various allies to unite and betray Rome. However, there were also many drawbacks to this system, the biggest problem being the slow transmission of orders from Rome. During wartime, the army could not assemble quickly enough. In order to solve this, to address this shortcoming, Rome began to build roads on a massive scale. In fact, wherever people gather, there will be roads. Rome simply turned these roads into highways. Moreover, the Romans no longer named roads after places, but instead named them after people. Because as Rome continued to expand outward, if roads were named after places, once a road extended beyond that region, the name would no longer be appropriate. Therefore, the road would be named after whoever proposed its construction. For example, in 312 BC, the Appian Way, which was proposed by Appius, originally started from Rome and led to Capua, which had just come under Roman control. But as Rome expanded, the road eventually extended to Brescia, the southernmost part of Italy. After the Appian Way, the Romans went on to build the Via Flaminia, the Via Cassia, the Via Aurelia, and others. This is how the saying, "all roads lead to Rome," came about. From their road building, you can see that, unlike other peoples who focused on defense, the Romans were a people who typically liked to expand outward. As Rome expanded into southern Italy, they encountered the Samnites, who lived in the mountains. The Romans forgot the lesson they had learned years earlier from the Celts, and thought that this group of monkeys living in the mountains would be easy to deal with. As a result, their army was trapped in a mountain valley by the Samnites. Previously, the two sides had never interacted, but as Rome's sphere of influence kept expanding, the Samnites' territory became an obstacle. They had no ambition to defeat Rome, so they hid in the mountains and fought guerrilla warfare. The Roman legions, on the other hand, were better suited for battles on the plains. Rome tried several times to lure the enemy onto the plains, but not only did they fail, they were also trapped by the Samnites in the Caudine Forks. As many as 10,000 Roman legionaries built a camp in the gorge, digging trenches and erecting fences for defense. But the Samnites did not attack. They knew very well that Roman soldiers were quite fierce in hand-to-hand combat, so they simply chose to lay siege. Every attempt by the Roman soldiers to break out ended in failure. What followed was hunger. After they finished all their food, they began to slaughter horses for sustenance. When even the horses were gone, the Roman legion had no choice but to surrender. The Samnites demanded that the Romans withdraw from their territory and forever respect the territorial sovereignty of the Samnite people, and they also detained 600 Roman soldiers as hostages. The Romans had long been accustomed to defeat, but the thought of surrender still haunted them. The last time they surrendered was 70 years ago during the Celtic invasion, a crisis that nearly led to the destruction of Rome. And this surrender was hardly any better. The Samnites forced the Roman soldiers to discard their weapons and walk out of the gorge, and they even had to take off their armor and clothes, leaving only their white undergarments. In Rome, only slaves would be dressed like this. The punishment from the Samnite soldiers did not stop there. They forced the Roman soldiers to pass through the yoke of spears, a gate made by propping up spears. And as the Romans walked through, Samnite soldiers standing on both sides hurled insults at them, and some even jabbed the Romans with their spears. Many Roman soldiers were injured and fell to the ground because of this, or even died on the spot. This was the humiliation at Caudine Forks that occurred in 321 BC, also known as the humiliation of the yoke. For the Romans, honor was of utmost importance, and in this regard, the Samnites wounded them deeply. The Roman soldiers, who were lucky enough to escape this humiliation, returned to Rome naked, like slaves. Fortunately, unlike in Greece, defeated Roman generals would not be punished. They valued the collective more, believing that a commander entrusted with great responsibility already suffered greatly from such a defeat, so there was no need to punish him further. If this had happened in ancient Greece, the first executed after a defeat would have been the commanding general. The Romans did not seek revenge, turning pain into motivation. They continued to expand Roman alliance and optimize supply lines. After optimizing their supply routes, they gradually formed an encirclement around the Samnite territory, and by this time, Rome's combat strength had already doubled. In 316 BC, the Romans were finally ready to take their revenge. For this, Rome spent a full 5 years preparing to wipe away their previous humiliation. I really wonder how the Romans got through those 5 years. As expected, the Samnites were forced to sign a peace treaty with the Romans. But this peace only lasted for a few years. Various tribes in the north of Rome rose up in arms, believing that since Rome was focusing all its efforts on the south, they could seize this opportunity to crush Rome in one blow. The Umbrians living in the east, along with the Samnites who had been driven deep into the mountains, also decided to join the war. The Roman legions were besieged from the east, south, and north all at once, but the Romans still had confidence that they could repel their enemies. In such a crisis, Rome would normally appoint a dictator to take command, but this time they did not, because the only suitable candidate for dictator was Fabius from the aristocracy, and the commoners would definitely not agree to that. To avoid further conflict between the aristocrats and the commoners during this period, they decided not to appoint a dictator. In 297 BC, the four armies of the Celts, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Samnites had completed their assembly, and Rome's main force was also arrayed just 6 kilometers from the enemy. This battle was fought with exceptional ferocity. Although the Etruscans withdrew from the battlefield early, the bravery and prowess of the Celtic cavalry were renowned throughout the world. In fact, after Caesar later conquered the Celts, he integrated all his cavalry with the Celts and even put them in command. The Roman legions were completely powerless when facing the Celtic cavalry. The commanding consul, Decius, helplessly cried out to the gods, vowing to offer his own life in exchange for a Roman victory. Hearing this, the retreating Roman soldiers were deeply ashamed. They pulled themselves together and followed their commander to charge at the enemy. At this moment, the other consul, Fabius, also arrived to provide reinforcements, and the tide of the battle finally began to turn. In the battle that day, the enemy coalition lost 28-0 men, with more than 8-0 captured. On the Roman side, over 7-0 were killed, and Consul Decius fulfilled his vow by dying on the battlefield. In 290 BC, Rome completed its domination of central and southern Italy. As they continued to move southward, Rome's next opponents were the Greeks along the southern coastal regions of Italy. The Romans seemed destined to take a beating. They were beaten by the Celts, then by the Samnites, and now they were about to be beaten by the Greeks. The conflict began when Roman ships appeared in Greek territory. The Italian peninsula is shaped like a long boot, and the Greeks' territory was located at the sole of the boot, that is, the southernmost coastal region. In 283 BC, 10 Roman ships appeared off the coast of Tarentum. Among the Greek city-states in southern Italy, Tarentum was one of the most prominent, and its founding was no later than that of Rome. Tarentum also had an excellent geographical location, serving as a natural harbor, and even today it remains a major naval base for the Italian Navy. The 10 Roman ships that entered Tarentum may have been seeking shelter from a storm, but Tarentum, without distinguishing right from wrong, quickly sank 5 of the Roman ships and killed all their crew, while the remaining 5 barely managed to escape. Rome demanded compensation from Tarentum, stating that their ships had docked not with the intention of invasion, yet they had been attacked by Tarentum. But not only did the people of Tarentum refuse to pay compensation, they even mocked the Roman envoy who came to negotiate, saying that he sounded like a country bumpkin when he spoke Greek. Now the Romans found themselves in a dilemma. They wanted to fight, but didn't dare to. At that time, Alexander had already been dead for many years, and Greece itself was already in utter chaos.
Subscribe to Animystika, not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.